The nurse fired and walking home until 5 Mafia supercars surrounded her. "Where's the nurse?" They took her badge, handed her a cardboard box, and told her she was finished. After 5 years of saving lives, Nurse Cassidy Reed was fired for saving a child without following protocol. Broken, humiliated, walking home in the pouring Chicago rain, Cassie thought her life was over. She was wrong. A convoy of 5 black Maybachs sedans wasn't just stopping in the middle of the street, they were stopping for her. Armed men in black suits poured out, and the man who stepped from the center car made the entire block go silent. Ronan Hale, the devil of Chicago, the most feared mafia boss in the country. But it wasn't his presence that changed everything. It was the words his bodyguard shouted through the rain. "We don't want the doctor, we want the nurse." This is the story of how one woman went from unemployed to becoming the queen of an underground empire, all because she knew how to save a life that no doctor could. If you love stories about underdogs getting the justice they deserve, smash that like button. It helps more than you know. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a story. See you in the next one. Cassie took a step back, the soaked cardboard box trembling in her hands. She couldn't believe what was happening. Just minutes ago, she had been an unemployed woman dragging herself home through the rain, and now she was surrounded by armed men and the most notorious mafia boss in Chicago. "Who are you? I'm not involved in any of this." She tried to turn and run, but a tall man in a black suit blocked her from behind. It was Kieran, the head of security, the one who had just shouted that strange line. "Miss Reed, please, there's no time." His voice wasn't threatening. It was urgent, almost pleading. Before Cassie could react, Ronan Hale stepped up in front of her. He grabbed her wrist, not roughly, but with raw desperation. When she looked into his eyes, Cassie didn't see the chill of a crime lord. She saw fear, the pure fear of a father losing his child. "My son is dying," Ronan's voice shook, nothing like the image of the Chicago devil people whispered about. "Every doctor says he can't be saved, but they said you know how." Cassie shook her head, trying to pull her hand free. "I was just fired. I'm not even a nurse anymore." "I don't care what you are." Ronan tightened his grip, his eyes bloodshot. "I just need you to save my son." The rain still poured down in sheets, but none of them noticed. Kieran stepped forward, speaking fast and crisp like he was reporting from a battlefield. "Finn, 8 years old, fell down the stairs 2 hours ago. Severe neck trauma. Emergency tracheotomy needed, but..." He hesitated, looking at Ronan as if asking permission to continue. Ronan nodded once, and Kieran went on. "The boy has Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. His blood vessels are as thin as wet paper. Any standard metal instrument will tear them and kill him." Cassie went rigid. Ehlers-Danlos. The name hit her like a blade straight through the chest. Sophie, the little girl with wide eyes and a smile like an angel. The child Cassie had cared for 2 years. The child who had died in her arms. "How do you know about me?" Cassie asked, her voice gone hoarse. Ronan looked at her, sharpness and desperation cutting across his face. "I have people in every hospital in Chicago. When my private doctor said no one could save Finn, I ordered them to find anyone who could. They found your file." He paused for a beat. "You cared for an Ehlers-Danlos patient for 2 years. You developed a special technique. It isn't in any textbook." Cassie closed her eyes. Memories of Sophie surged in like a tide. The nights without sleep beside the hospital bed. The way Cassie's heart clenched every time the girl struggled to breathe. And then at last, the moment Sophie let out her final breath in Cassie's arms. "I couldn't save her," Cassie whispered, her voice cracking open. "The girl I cared for, she died." Silence. The rain kept falling. Ronan said nothing for a few seconds. Then he bent slightly, staring straight into Cassie's eyes. His voice was cold, but something inside it was breaking. "Then save my son so that little girl's death won't be meaningless." The words landed like a punch to Cassie's chest. She looked into Ronan's eyes and saw the agony of a father standing on the edge of losing everything. and she saw herself in it, the pain of losing what mattered most. "All right." Cassie heard her own voice as if someone else were speaking through her. "Take me there." Ronan gave a single nod, then pulled her toward the Maybach in the center. The car door opened and Cassie climbed in, still clutching the soaked cardboard box. She didn't know why she was still holding it. Maybe because it was the only thing left of her old life. The convoy took off at once, cutting through the wind and the streets of Chicago. Inside the car, the silence was heavy. Ronan sat across from Cassie, his gaze fixed on her. "Why did they fire you?" he asked abruptly. Cassie stared out the window, rain still streaming in rivulets down the glass. "I gave epinephrine to a dying child without waiting for the chief attending's permission. The boy lived. Dr. Harrington didn't like being proven wrong." Ronan didn't speak, only nodded slowly. But the way his eyes narrowed at the name, Harrington said he'd memorized it. The convoy kept driving through the rain. Ronan watched Cassie, his voice dropping lower. "If you save my son, I'll give you anything you want. And if you don't—" He didn't finish. The silence was more frightening than any threat. Cassie didn't look back, her eyes still on the gray curtain of rain outside. "Just take me there." The Maybach convoy cut through a massive iron gate. Armed guards lined up on both sides, rigid as statues. Cassie looked out through the window and couldn't believe her eyes. The Hale estate rose up like a palace in the heart of Chicago, with soaring white stone columns and grounds that seemed to stretch forever. Even as they drowned beneath the gray curtain of rain, no matter how grand it was, the air here felt as heavy as a funeral. Not a single bird call, not a trace of laughter, only the rain and a deadly silence. The car stopped at the main entrance. Ronan stepped out first and pulled Cassie with him. She was still clutching the soaked cardboard box, but no one paid it any attention. Inside the mansion, servants stood along both sides of the hall, every face tight with worry. They lowered their heads as Ronan passed, but their eyes followed Cassie with a mix of curiosity and hope. Cassie took everything in as they moved through the sitting room. The house was breathtakingly luxurious, filled with expensive paintings, classic furniture, and crystal chandeliers that caught the light. But it was cold, hollow, more museum than home. Only one small corner by a window held any color. A bright, multicolored rug lay on the floor. A few toys scattered carelessly. Children's scribbled drawings taped to the wall, and a framed photograph of a father and son. Ronan and a dark-haired boy were laughing, and the man in the picture looked nothing like the cold, desperate figure Cassie was seeing now. Beside it, on a wooden shelf, stood a photograph of a woman, beautiful, gentle, eyes as blue as the sea. Cassie didn't ask and Ronan didn't explain. They kept going. The private medical suite was at the end of the second-floor corridor. When the door opened, Cassie froze at what she saw. This wasn't an ordinary sick room. It was a miniature intensive care unit, stocked with state-of-the-art equipment many hospitals could only dream about. A ventilator, cardiac monitors, oxygen sensors, and a long list of machines Cassie recognized instantly. Inside, a medical team of 4 or 5 stood around the bed, every face drawn tight with strain, and in the middle of them stood a gray-haired man, about 55, wearing a white coat. That had to be Dr. Harrison Webb, the one Cassie had heard mentioned. When Webb saw Cassie step in, his brow furrowed. He sized her up from head to toe, skepticism plain on his face. "This is Cassandra Reed. She's far too young." Cassie didn't flinch. She set the cardboard box on the floor and met his eyes, her voice cold as ice. "Age doesn't place a catheter. Hands do. Let me see the patient." Webb opened his mouth to argue, but Ronan cut him off. The Mafia boss's voice filled the room, calm and absolute with authority. "Whatever she says, you do it. Do you understand?" No one dared to contradict him. Webb stepped back. The team shifted apart, and Cassie finally saw the boy in the bed. Her heart felt like it was being crushed. Finn Hale, 8 years old, lay there with the same dark hair as his father and bright blue eyes fixed on her. Fear hiding behind the bravery he was trying to hold together. His skin was so pale it was nearly translucent, blue veins visible beneath it, delicate as the underside of a flower petal. His neck was swollen, and the temporary airway tube attached to him was clearly failing. Finn's breathing rasped, heavy and wet, as if every breath were a battle. Cassie moved closer to the bed. He looked so much like Sophie. The same fragility, the same see-through skin, the same look of a child forcing courage into place while terror lived in his bones. She swallowed the ache in her throat and sat beside him, offering the gentlest smile she could manage. "Hey there, sweetheart. My name's Cassie. I'm going to help you breathe easier, all right?" Finn stared at her, those blue eyes blinking. He tried to speak, his voice a thin, painful whisper as if each word cost him. "Are you a doctor?" Cassie shook her head slightly, still smiling. "I'm a nurse, and sometimes a nurse can do things a doctor can't." Something flickered in Finn's eyes, maybe hope, maybe trust. Whatever it was enough for Cassie to know she couldn't fail, not this time. She rose and turned to the medical team, her voice clear and decisive, the voice of someone giving orders in an emergency room. A soft silicone tube 4 millimeters in diameter, right now. No one objected. They moved at once to prepare it. Ronan stood at the bedside, his hand clamped around his son's, his eyes never leaving Finn for even a second. And in that moment, Cassie saw the truth. Ronan Hale, the Chicago devil, the Mafia boss who made the whole city tremble, was utterly powerless. All his power, his money, his terror meant nothing against the death threatening to steal his child away. He couldn't do a thing, only Cassie could. Cassie walked to the sink, turned on the faucet, and began washing each finger with careful, exacting precision, the way she'd done thousands of times over 5 years in the emergency room. Cold water ran over her skin, but she didn't feel it. Her mind had narrowed to a single point, the boy lying on that bed. The room went silent as paper. Everyone held their breath, tracking her every movement. Dr. Webb stood nearby with an instrument tray in his hands, skepticism still written on his face, yet he didn't dare speak a word. Cassie pulled on her gloves. The familiar sensation of thin rubber sealing around her hands steadied her. This was what she knew. This was what she was good at. When she turned back toward the bed, Ronan spoke abruptly. "Where did you learn this technique? It isn't in any textbook." Cassie didn't look up, her eyes fixed on the soft silicone tube the team had just placed in her hands. "From a little girl named Sophie." Her voice dropped. "She had the same condition as your son. Every doctor said she'd only live 6 months. I kept her alive for 2 years. Ronan went quiet for a beat. "And then what happened to her?" Cassie's hands paused for a single second, her voice trembling despite the restraint she fought for. "She died in my arms." She drew a long breath and kept going. "But before that, I learned every millimeter of her body, how to touch without breaking, how to heal without causing pain." No one spoke again. Cassie moved to Finn's bedside, the soft silicone tube in her hand, not the hard metal used as standard, not the thing that would tear the boy's fragile vessels, but the method she had found herself after hundreds of sleepless nights beside Sophie's bed. She looked down at Finn. He was looking back at her, blue eyes full of fear and full of trust. "You're going to feel a little uncomfortable, okay? But I promise I'll be as gentle as I can." Finn gave a weak nod. Cassie began. Her hands didn't shake. These were the hands that had threaded a needle into a collapsing vein inside a moving ambulance. These were the hands that had held the beating heart of a trauma patient. These were the hands Dr. Harrington had said had no right to decide anything. Sweat gathered at her hairline, but every motion remained perfectly precise. She guided the silicone tube in, millimeter by millimeter, gentle as if she were lifting a flower petal. Finn's vessels were as delicate as wet paper, and the smallest mistake could unleash bleeding no one could stop. Dr. Webb and the team stood motionless like statues, no one daring to breathe too hard. Ronan stood at the bedside, gripping the rail so tightly his knuckles blanched white. His eyes were locked on his son, as if looking away for even a second might make the boy disappear. Cassie advanced the tube a little farther. She could feel every tiniest shift through her fingertips. This was a skill no textbook could teach. This was something learned only through thousands of hours of practice, through sleepless nights, through tears and loss. Then suddenly, the monitor shrieked. The alarm ripped through the room's silence. Everyone jolted. Webb stared at the screen, his face draining of color. The tube touched a sensitive spot. Cassie didn't panic. She stopped, drew a deep breath. Around her, everyone was holding their breath, hearts hammering out of control. But she closed her eyes for a single second and whispered so softly only she could hear, "Sophie, guide me." She opened her eyes, adjusted the angle of the tube, rotated it slightly to the right by 2 degrees, and continued, gentle, exact, as if someone were leading her hand. The tube slid past the sensitive point and into the correct position. Cassie connected it to the breathing system, then stepped back. The room fell into absolute silence. 1 second passed, 2, then Finn inhaled, deep, clear, strong, like a drowning person breaking the surface. At last, the monitor sounded again, but this time it was the music of life. The heartbeat steadied, the oxygen level climbed, 80%, 90%, 95%. Color slowly returned to Finn's skin. His lips were no longer blue. His chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm. Each breath a miracle. Dr. Webb let out a trembling exhale. It worked. My God, it worked. The medical team looked at Cassie as if she'd done the impossible, and maybe she had. Finn opened his eyes, those vivid blue eyes lifting to his father's. He whispered, weak but clear, and it was the most beautiful sound this room had ever heard. "Dad, I can breathe now." Ronan Hale, the Chicago Devil, the Mafia boss who made the whole city tremble, couldn't find a single word. He only bent down, pressed his forehead to his son's, and his shoulders shook. Cassie stepped back and leaned against the wall. She was drained. Her whole body trembled as the adrenaline began to fade. She looked down at her hands, the hands that had just saved a life, the hands Dr. Harrington had said only a few hours ago had no right to make decisions. "You're just a nurse," he'd said. "You don't have the authority to act." But these hands had just done what no doctor could. These hands had just held on to a life. And for the first time in a very long time, after nights of crying alone in a shabby apartment, after days of working like a machine just to pay off debt, after losing Sophie and losing the unborn child she never got to meet, Cassandra Reed felt that she mattered. 10 minutes after the procedure, the room began to settle into quiet. Finn had drifted to sleep, his breathing steady, his chest rising and falling in an even rhythm. The boy was out of immediate danger, but Cassie knew the first 24 hours were the most critical. Any complication could strike. She sat in the chair beside the bed, her body so exhausted she couldn't stand. Her eyes felt heavy, but she didn't dare sleep. Not now. Not when the boy's life was still fragile. In the corner of the room, the soaked cardboard box still lay where it had been forgotten. The belongings of 5 years of her working life were still inside. The ceramic mug, the old photo, the bottle of ibuprofen, small ordinary things that only hours ago had been everything she owned. Now she could almost forget they existed. The door opened softly. Cassie lifted her head and saw Ronan step in. He'd changed out of the wetsuit into a simple black shirt, carrying a steaming cup of coffee and a wool blanket. He didn't say anything. He only set the coffee on the table beside her, then gently draped the blanket over her shoulders. The gesture startled Cassie. It was too gentle, too attentive. Nothing like the cold Mafia boss she'd heard whispered about. "You should rest," Ronan said, his voice low, no longer edged with ice the way it had been before. Cassie shook her head. I need to monitor him for the first 24 hours. Complications can happen at any time. Ronan didn't try to persuade her. He only nodded and sat down in the chair across from her on the other side of the bed. They sat in silence for a while, both watching Finn sleep. The boy's face was peaceful, lips slightly parted, nothing like the pain and terror of a few hours earlier. Then Ronan spoke, his voice carrying a hint of curiosity. You're the only nurse who didn't ask for money. Cassie looked at him, a little surprised. You haven't offered anything. Ronan gave a faint smile, thin, but with something almost amused in it. I transferred $500,000 into your account 2 hours ago. Cassie froze. She thought she'd misheard. What? I also paid off your debt. Ronan continued as calmly as if he were talking about the weather. $80,000 gone, all of it. Cassie couldn't speak. She just sat there, her mouth slightly open, her mind refusing to process what she'd heard. $500,000 debt-free in one night. Consider it a thank you, Ronan said, his eyes still on his son. Nothing more, nothing less. Cassie finally found her voice, and the first thing that came out was anger. How do you know about my debt? Ronan turned to her, his gaze direct, without the slightest attempt to dodge it. I needed to know who was going to hold my son's life in her hands. I had to investigate. Cassie felt heat rush into her face. You have no right. I have every right. Ronan cut in, his voice never rising, yet heavy with authority. But I didn't use that information against you. I used it to repay you. A tense silence settled over the room. Cassie wanted to be furious, wanted to shout that he'd invaded her privacy, but at the same time she couldn't deny he'd just lifted the weight that had crushed her shoulders for 2 years. Ronan looked toward Finn, his voice lowering. Today I almost lost my son. He paused, then turned back to Cassie, gray eyes searching. You know what that feels like, don't you? Cassie didn't answer, but her eyes blinked, and she knew Ronan had seen it. He knew. He knew about the child she had lost, but he didn't ask more. He didn't force her to speak. He only stayed quiet, respecting a grief she wasn't ready to share. Ronan stood and walked toward the door. Before he stepped out, he stopped and spoke without turning around. Rest, Cassidy. You've earned it. Then he left, and the door closed softly behind him. Cassie sat there for a long time, staring into nothing. Then slowly she pulled out her phone and opened her banking app. The balance flashed on the screen. She had to look 3 times to be sure she wasn't imagining it. $500,000, and the $80,000 gambling debt from Ryan, the debt that had crushed her for 2 years, the debt that had forced her to work like a machine and live in a shabby apartment, was gone. Cassie set the phone down, leaned back in the chair, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was choking on debt. Early sunlight slipped through the gap in the curtains, spilling into the hospital room in warm, golden bands. Cassie had dozed off in the chair without realizing it. Her brown hair fell over her shoulders, her tired face marked by dark circles under her eyes. Yet her hand still gripped the edge of Finn's bed, as if even in sleep she couldn't forget her duty. Finn woke first. He blinked a few times, looked around the unfamiliar room crowded with machines, and then his vivid blue gaze settled on the woman asleep beside him. He tilted his head, studying her with the pure, unfiltered curiosity of a child. Who was she? Why was she here? Why was she holding his hand? Finn slowly reached out, his small fingers touching Cassie's hair, stroking it lightly as if he were brushing the wing of a butterfly. Cassie startled awake. Professional instinct made her sit up straight at once, her eyes sweeping the monitor to check the numbers, then dropping to Finn with immediate concern. How do you feel? Do you hurt anywhere? Finn shook his head, a faint smile appearing on his lips. He looked at Cassie with wide eyes, admiration shining there. Are you an angel? Dad said an angel saved me. Cassie blinked, surprised. Then she smiled. A real smile, the first in a very long time. I'm just a nurse. Finn shook his head, his expression so serious it was adorable. Nurses are angels, too. Angels in blue. The child's innocent words caught in Cassie's throat. She didn't know what to say. For years, she'd been called many things: staff, subordinate, defiant. But an angel? That was the first time. At the doorway, Ronan stood perfectly still. No one knew how long he'd been there, but he had seen everything. The moment Finn touched Cassie's hair. The moment she woke and immediately worried about his son. The moment she smiled at the boy. And something changed on Ronan's face. The familiar coldness melted away, replaced by something softer, warmer, something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Finn spotted his father and his face lit up. "Dad, can Cassie stay? Please, Dad." Ronan walked into the room and sat beside his son's bed. He looked at Finn with a tenderness Cassie had never seen on him before. "That depends on her, son." Finn turned to Cassie at once, those big blue eyes fixed on her with a pleading look. "Cassie, will you stay? Please." Cassie looked at the boy, and it felt as if someone were squeezing her heart. She thought of Sophie, the child she had cared for 2 years, the child she had loved like her own, the child who had died in her arms. She hadn't been able to save Sophie. That pain was still there, still smoldering every day. But maybe this was a second chance, not to fix a mistake, because she wasn't to blame for Sophie's death, but to keep going, to make sure what she had learned from Sophie wasn't wasted, to let these hands keep saving people. Finn took her hand, his small palm warm. "Cassie, will you stay with me?" A simple question from an 8-year-old child, but heavy as the whole world. Cassie looked at Ronan. He didn't speak. He only watched her with a patient, waiting gaze, not forcing, not demanding. Then she looked down at Finn, the boy's eyes full of hope. "Let me think about it, okay?" Finn looked a little disappointed, but he nodded obediently. Cassie smiled and gently smoothed his hair, but inside her, the answer had been there for a long time already. That afternoon, a servant came to the hospital room and told Cassie that Mr. Hale wanted to see her in his study. Cassie nodded, checked on Finn one last time, then followed. Ronan's study was at the end of the first-floor corridor behind a heavy oak door. When Cassie stepped inside, she felt as if she were walking into a different world. The room was dark, luxurious, and it gave off a kind of terrifying power. Bookshelves rose all the way to the ceiling, packed with leather-bound volumes. Expensive oil paintings hung on the walls, and at the center sat a massive oak desk, so large it could have served as a conference table for 10 people. Ronan was seated behind it, and Cassie understood immediately that the man in front of her was no longer the desperate father or the man who had cried beside his son's bed. He was the Mafia boss again, with cold gray eyes and a face no one could read. "Sit." Ronan gestured toward the chair across from the desk. Cassie sat, keeping her back straight and her gaze steady. She didn't know where this meeting would lead, but she'd learned long ago that you never looked weak in front of powerful people. Ronan was quiet for a moment, watching her as if he were weighing her. Then he spoke, his voice low and full of authority. "I want to hire you as Finn's private nurse, full-time." Cassie wasn't surprised. She'd guessed this the moment Finn asked if she could stay, but she remained silent, waiting. Ronan continued. "Salary of $300,000 a year. You'll live at the estate. All living expenses covered in full. Security 24/7. The best premium health insurance." He paused, watching for her reaction. Cassie drew a slow breath. $300,000 a year, 6 times what she'd made at St. Michael's. Enough to live comfortably for the rest of her life without worry, but she wasn't the kind of woman blinded by money. "You know I was just fired," she said evenly. "I don't have a reputation left." Ronan shrugged as if it meant nothing. "Reputation won't save my son. You did. That's all I need to know." Cassie met his eyes. "I'm a nurse, Mr. Hale. Not anything else you might need." Ronan lifted an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement passing through his eyes. "What do you think I need?" Cassie didn't look away. She knew she was playing with fire, but she wasn't the type to pretend she didn't know the truth. "I know who you are, the Chicago Devil. I know what your empire is built on." Ronan said nothing. No denial, no confirmation, only that unreadable stare. Cassie went on. I won't be involved in anything illegal. I'm a nurse, not an accomplice. The silence stretched. Cassie thought she might have pushed too far. Maybe he would get angry. Maybe he would throw her out. But she didn't regret it. If she was going to work here, she needed to set boundaries from the start. I have conditions, she said. Ronan tilted his head. Say them. 1, I won't take part in any illegal activity. 2, my only job is Finn's health care, nothing else. 3, she paused and drew a breath. If you do anything that puts Finn in danger, I will take him and disappear, and you'll never find us. Deadly silence. Cassie could feel the air in the room thicken. She had just threatened the most notorious Mafia boss in Chicago in his own study, with dozens of armed guards right outside the door. Ronan stared at her. 1 second passed. 2. Then unexpectedly he smiled. Not the dangerous smile she'd seen when he faced enemies. This was a smile of respect. You're willing to threaten me. His voice held something like amusement. Cassie didn't flinch. I'm not threatening you. I'm telling you the truth. Ronan studied her a moment longer as if seeing her for the first time. Then he stood, walked around the massive desk, and stopped directly in front of her. He held out his hand. Deal. Welcome to the Hale Empire, Cassidy. Cassie looked at his hand, the hand that had gripped hers last night, the hand that had trembled when his son was dying, the hand of the Chicago devil. She reached out and took it. Call me Cassie. Ronan tightened his grip, gray eyes locked on hers. Then call me Ronan. 2 weeks passed like a dream. Cassie had officially moved into the Hale estate, and her life changed completely. Her private room was on the 2nd floor, right beside Finn's room, more spacious than the shabby apartment she'd once rented. A wide window looked out over a lush green garden, and the morning sun poured in, keeping the room warm. Her closet had been filled with new clothes. Ronan had sent people to buy them without asking her opinion. Cassie meant to refuse, but then she realized she had nothing left to wear besides the rain-soaked outfit from that day and a few things in the cardboard box. She accepted, but she kept her old ceramic mug on her desk, the one that read, "Nurses call the shots." It was the only thing from her old life she wanted to hold on to. Every day began with her morning check on Finn, taking his vitals, making sure he took his medication on time. In the afternoon, she supervised everything he did, careful not to let him run or play too hard because of the fragile blood vessels in his body. In the evening, if Ronan was home, she reported Finn's condition to him. Everything moved in a steady rhythm, strangely peaceful. Finn clung to Cassie the way a child clings to a mother. He followed her everywhere, asked her endless questions about the world, begged her to read to him every night before bed. No one had ever cared for him so attentively, and Finn returned it with the unconditional affection only a child can give. The servants in the mansion began treating Cassie differently too. They called her Miss Reed with genuine respect, no longer with the weary, curious looks from the first days. And the Hale estate, once as cold as a museum, began to hold warmth. Finn's laughter echoed down the halls, his footsteps running across the wooden floors, his voice calling Cassie everywhere. Ronan traveled often for business. Cassie didn't ask where he went or what he did, and he didn't explain. When he was home, he was still distant and quiet, keeping space between himself and everyone except Finn. But some nights late, when Cassie woke to check on Finn, she would catch Ronan standing outside his son's door, silently watching the boy sleep. He didn't know she was there. And in those moments, Cassie could see the father behind the Mafia boss's mask. One evening, as Cassie read a story to Finn, the boy asked suddenly, "Cassie, do you know my mom?" Cassie paused and looked down at the child in her arms. "No, sweetheart, but I've seen her picture. She was very beautiful." Finn nodded, his blue eyes distant. "Dad says she was gentle and kind. Dad keeps her picture in his wallet." Silence for a moment. Then Finn went on, his voice so small Cassie almost didn't hear it. "I don't remember her, but I pretend I do, so Dad won't be sad." Cassie's heart clenched as if someone had squeezed it tight. She held the boy closer, feeling the thin, fragile warmth of his small body in her arms. He was only 8 years old, yet he already knew how to hide his own pain to protect his father. That night, after Finn had fallen asleep, Cassie sat beside his bed and understood something. Her heart, the heart that had frozen after Sophie's death, after losing the unborn child she never got to meet, after the hell of a marriage with Ryan, was slowly beginning to melt. This wasn't just a job anymore. This was family. 3 weeks had passed since Cassie moved into the Hale estate. That night, she was sitting in the reading room when she heard commotion downstairs. A car door slammed, rushed footsteps, Kieran barking urgent orders. Cassie stepped into the hallway and saw Ronan being helped inside. His shirt was stained with blood, his left arm wrapped in a crude strip of cloth, and his face was paler than usual. Kieran saw her and came closer, his voice a whisper. "There was a traitor. It's been handled." He didn't say more, and Cassie didn't ask. She knew where her boundaries were. Ronan shrugged off assistance and went straight into his study, slamming the door behind him. Cassie returned to her room, but she couldn't sleep. The image of Ronan's blood-soaked arm kept replaying in her mind. That wound needed to be treated properly, not wrapped like a quick fix. After an hour of turning and staring at the ceiling, she got up and went downstairs. Ronan's study was drowned in darkness with only moonlight slipping through the windows and laying pale, wavering bands across the room. He sat in a chair, a glass of whiskey in one hand, eyes fixed on the night beyond the glass. Dr. Webb was away on a trip, and clearly Ronan had no intention of calling anyone else to tend the injury. Cassie walked in without knocking. "You need to change the bandage." Ronan didn't turn around. "It's nothing, just a scratch." Cassie moved closer and looked at his arm. Blood had soaked through 3 layers of gauze and was dripping onto the wooden floor. "A scratch doesn't bleed through 3 layers of dressing. Sit still." Her voice wasn't a request. It was an order. Ronan watched her for a moment, then set the whiskey down and let her work. Cassie pulled the first aid kit from a cabinet drawer, dragged a chair beside him, and began removing the old bandage. When she rolled up his sleeve to reach the wound, she saw something that stopped her cold. Beneath the fabric, Ronan's arm was covered in scars, old and new, long and short. Some had faded to white, some were still pink. She didn't speak. She only kept working. The cut was deep, but it hadn't hit an artery. She disinfected it, stitched it closed with precise, steady passes of the needle, then wrapped it carefully. Ronan watched her work in silence. Then he spoke. "You're not afraid of me." Not a question, a statement. Cassie didn't look up, her hands still moving as she secured the wrap. "I used to be afraid of someone. Compared to him, you're not scary at all." Ronan looked surprised. Him. Silence. Cassie kept wrapping, but her hands slowed. Ronan didn't push. He only sat there waiting. And maybe it was that patient, unpressured silence that made Cassie speak. "My ex-husband." She paused, drew a deep breath. "I married Ryan Reed when I was 23. I thought he was my salvation, an orphan finally stepping into a normal life." She continued bandaging, but her voice sounded as if she were telling a story about someone else, not herself. "Turns out he was addicted to gambling, and every time he lost, he took it out on me." Ronan said nothing. He only listened. "I got pregnant at 25. I thought maybe a baby would change everything." Cassie's voice trembled, but she forced it on. "One night he beat me until I lost the baby. 4 months along." A heavy silence filled the room. Moonlight fell across Cassie's face, and she knew Ronan could see the tears she was fighting to hold back. "I divorced him. A month later, he killed himself, and he left me with $80,000 in gambling debt." She stopped, inhaling in a shaky pull. "I couldn't even hate him properly. He took that right away from me, too." It was the first time she had told anyone, not a therapist, not a coworker, not even Sophie, the child she had loved most. She had buried this pain for 2 years, letting no one see it. And now she was telling it to a Mafia boss. Absurd. Ronan was silent for a long time. He didn't say, "I'm sorry," the way other people did. Those words were meaningless. Instead, he reached out and took her trembling hand, a gentle squeeze. The debt is gone. You don't owe anyone anything anymore. Cassie looked at him, eyes blurred with tears. Why do you care? Ronan met her gaze, and his gray eyes weren't cold now. Because you saved my son, and because no one should have to live through what you did. No pity, no judgment, only listening and understanding, and that was what Cassie needed most. She finished the bandage, stood up, and started to leave. Cassie. Ronan's voice stopped her. She turned back. He looked at her, moonlight carving sharp lines across his face. Thank you for trusting me. Cassie didn't answer. She only nodded and walked out. That night, back in her room, she sat by the window and cried for the first time in 2 years. Not because of pain, but because finally someone had seen her, seen the scars inside, and hadn't turned away. A month had passed since the night Cassie told Ronan about her past, and today was a special day, Finn's 9th birthday. Ronan decided to host a small party at the estate, inviting only the people closest to them. No showmanship, no extravagance, just a simple, warm family celebration that Finn deserved to have. Cassie got up early to help decorate. She hung balloons in every color throughout the living room, fastened a large banner that read, Happy 9th birthday to the wall, and arranged the party table with plates of sweets Finn loved. The boy ran circles around her, excitement spilling out of him. And Max, the golden retriever Ronan had given him the week before, darted after him with his tail wagging hard enough to shake his whole body. Cassie, how much longer? Finn asked for the 10th time that morning. Cassie laughed and crouched to ruffle his hair. Just a few more hours, sweetheart. Be patient. What surprised Cassie most was how everyone treated her. No one looked at her like an employee anymore. Kieran nodded to her the way he would greet the lady of the house. The servants came to her for decisions about the menu, about the flowers, about where to place the tables. They treated her as if she were part of the Hale family. In the afternoon, the guests began to arrive. Not many, only about 20 people, mostly Ronan's most trusted guards and a few business partners who had brought their families. The atmosphere was warm and easy, nothing like the usual chill that lived in the mansion's walls. When the birthday cake was carried out, Finn squealed with joy. 9 candles glittered on the white frosting, their tiny flames dancing in the boy's blue eyes. Everyone sang the birthday song, and Finn closed his eyes, lips moving in a silent wish. Then he drew in a deep breath, lungs so much stronger than they'd been 2 months before, and blew out every candle in a single try. Cassie stood beside him, helping him cut the cake, and she felt Ronan's gaze on the two of them. She looked up and caught him watching her with an expression warmer than she'd ever seen on him. One more gift, son. Ronan stepped forward, holding a large box wrapped in blue paper. Finn's eyes went wide. He tore the wrapping in a burst of eager hands, and when he saw what was inside, he let out a delighted shout. It was the enormous Star Wars Lego set he'd been dreaming about for months. Dad, you're the best. Finn threw his arms around Ronan, small arms hooked around his father's neck. Thank you, Dad. This is the best birthday ever. Ronan held his son, his eyes soft. The best. Finn nodded hard, then turned to Cassie. The best because Cassie's here. Ronan looked at Cassie over Finn's shoulder, and she saw something strange and bright in those gray eyes. That night, when the party ended and the guests had gone home, Finn was asleep on the sofa, one arm wrapped around Max, his face smeared with a few streaks of frosting. Cassie covered him with a blanket and stepped onto the balcony, drawing in a breath of cool night air. Chicago stretched out in front of her, lights blinking like fallen stars scattered over the earth. Want a drink? Ronan's voice came from behind her. She turned and saw him there holding 2 glasses of wine. She took one and he came to stand beside her, both of them looking out into the night. Silence for a moment, then Ronan spoke. This is the first birthday Finn has had anyone besides me. Cassie took a small sip of wine. He deserves more than that. Ronan turned to look at her, his gaze searching. So do you. Cassie didn't answer. She only looked out into the distance. They stood side by side in silence, shoulders nearly touching, the warmth of his body reaching her through the chill of an autumn night. "You changed this house, Cassie," Ronan said, his voice low. "It used to be so cold." Cassie shook her head faintly. "Not me. Finn. He's the warmth." Ronan looked at her, gray eyes as if they were searching for something. "No, you two." Cassie turned to him, and she realized the space between them had narrowed without either of them noticing. She could see every hard line of his face, the faint scar through his eyebrow, and the moonlight reflected in his deep eyes. Ronan didn't touch her. He didn't say anything else. But the way he looked at her, the way he stood close, the way the air between them seemed to thicken, Cassie knew something was changing, and she wasn't sure whether she feared it or wanted it. 2 weeks after Finn's birthday, on a freezing November night, Cassie was sleeping deeply in her room. Moonlight slipped through the curtains, laying pale silver streaks across the floor. Everything was quiet, peaceful, until gunfire tore the night apart. Cassie bolted upright like a spring, her heart slamming against her ribs. It wasn't a dream. The shots kept coming, not one or two, but a rapid burst, as if a battle were raging right outside the mansion. Before she could even understand what was happening, her door was kicked open. Kieran stood there, face tight with strain, a gun in his hand, eyes sweeping the room in a quick, hard scan. "Miss Reed, get Finn to the safe room, now!" he shouted, his voice urgent in a way she'd never heard before. Then he vanished back into the hallway, heavy footsteps pounding away. Cassie didn't panic. 5 years in the emergency room had taught her how to stay calm in the worst kinds of danger. She leapt out of bed, bare feet hitting ice-cold wood, and ran for the door. The mansion lights were out, leaving only dim red emergency bulbs washing the corridor in a hellish glow. Gunfire still hammered from somewhere, mixed with shouts, breaking glass, and running feet. Cassie lunged into Finn's room next door. The boy was awake, curled up on the bed, eyes wide with terror. Max, the golden retriever, stood beside him, barking in frantic bursts. "Cassie, what's happening?" Finn's voice shook. Cassie didn't have time to explain. She ran to the bed and pulled him into her arms. "It's okay, sweetheart. Come with me right now." She lifted Finn, and he clung to her neck, burying his face against her shoulder. Cassie rushed into the hallway. Max sprinted behind them, claws clicking on the wood. The corridor was long and dark, lit only by that faint red glow. Gunshots echoed from everywhere, and she couldn't tell where they were coming from. Guards raced past, yelling orders to each other, no one paying attention to her. Cassie shielded Finn with her body, her back toward the gunfire, ready to take a bullet if she had to. She remembered the route to the safe basement. Ronan had shown it to her once, right after she moved in. The stairs at the end of the hallway, turn left. A steel door hidden behind a bookcase. She ran as fast as she could. As she neared the stairs, a dark shape stepped out of the shadows. Not a guard, a stranger in black, face covered, a gun already lifting and aiming straight at them. Cassie moved on instinct. She shoved Finn behind her and threw her body in front of him. "Run, Finn, run!" she screamed, eyes locked on the barrel pointed at her chest. She thought this was the end. She thought of Sophie, of the unborn child she never got to meet, of Ronan and Finn. At least she had protected him. Bang! The shot rang out, but Cassie didn't feel pain. She opened her eyes and saw the attacker dropping, a bullet hole in his head. Kieran stood behind them, his gun still smoking. "Go now," he roared, then led them down the stairs. Cassie scooped Finn up again and ran after Kieran, her heart still hammering wildly. They reached the steel door hidden behind the bookcase. Kieran punched in a code. The door swung open and they rushed inside. The steel door slammed shut behind them, cutting off every sound from outside. The safe room was brightly lit, stocked with water, food, and a silence so thick it felt suffocating. Cassie sat Finn down, and the boy immediately wrapped his arms around her, sobbing. "Where's Dad? Is he okay?" he asked, his voice breaking. Cassie held him tight, stroked his hair, and forced her voice to stay calm, even as her own heart splintered with worry. "Your dad is strong. He'll be okay. I'm here. No one can hurt you. 30 minutes passed like 30 years. Gunfire still thudded faintly through the thick walls, then slowly thinned and finally stopped. Cassie sat there, Finn in her arms, Max curled against their feet, and waited. Then the steel door opened. Ronan stood there. His white shirt was smeared with blood, but Cassie could tell it wasn't his. His face was ice, his gray eyes sharp as knives. But when he saw Finn in Cassie's arms, something in his gaze softened. "It's over, Finn. Are you all right?" Finn sprang out of Cassie's arms and ran to his father, crying, "Dad, I was so scared." Ronan held his son, kissed the top of his head, then lifted his eyes to Cassie. "You protected my son." Cassie stood, her legs still shaking. "It's my job." Ronan set Finn down, told him to wait a moment, then walked toward her, and before she could react, he pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. For the first time. "Thank you for being brave." Cassie stood there in his embrace, feeling the heat of his body, the sharp scent of gunpowder and blood on his shirt. She didn't speak. She only stayed still. Finn ran over and wrapped his arms around both of them. The three of them stood there in the safe room, holding each other like a family. Outside, the battle was over. But in Cassie's mind, one question remained, sharp and unsettled. The attacker knew exactly where the bedrooms were, knew the guard schedule, knew how to get into the estate. Who had leaked the information to them? The next morning, the air in Ronan's study was taut as a wire about to snap. Cassie stood at the doorway looking in. Ronan sat behind the desk, his face cold as stone. Kieran stood in front of him with 5 or 6 other guards. No one spoke, but the anger in the room could be felt like a living thing. Finn had been moved to another secure location under strict protection, so Ronan could focus on dealing with the problem. Kieran began his report, his voice low and tight. The attackers knew the exact location of Finn's bedroom, knew the route to the safe room, knew the guard's patrol schedule. They even knew the code to the outer gate. He paused and drew a breath. This was an inside job. Someone in this house sold us out. Ronan didn't speak. He only gripped the edge of the desk so hard his knuckles turned white. His silence was more frightening than any outburst. The suspect list includes every staff member, every guard, every servant, Kieran continued. We're checking them one by one. Ronan lifted his head, gray eyes cold as ice. Who knows the location of the safe room? Kieran hesitated for a second before answering. Only 5 people. You, me, Dr. Webb, the head of the guard team, and... His gaze flicked toward the door. Miss Reed. Every eye in the room turned to Cassie. She froze, feeling as if a bucket of icy water had been poured over her. They were suspecting her after everything she'd done. Ronan looked at her. 1 second passed, long as a century. Cassie didn't know what to say, didn't know what to do. She only stood there, meeting the gray eyes that seemed to pierce straight through her. No, not her, Ronan said flat and final. Kieran opened his mouth to argue. Sir, she's the newest. I said no. Ronan cut him off, voice like ice. Continue. Cassie let out a breath of relief, but her mind was spinning. Last night, when she ran to Finn's room, something had happened. She'd been too panicked to think about it then, but now the memory was rising back into place. Wait, she spoke up. Everyone looked at her. Cassie stepped into the room, forcing her thoughts into order. Last night, when I ran to Finn's room, someone tried to stop me in the hallway, 2nd floor near the east staircase. Ronan's brow lifted. One of the attackers! No. Cassie shook her head. He was wearing house clothes, and he told me to go another way toward the attackers, not away from them. Silence swallowed the room. Ronan stood and walked toward her. Who? What did he look like? Cassie closed her eyes, trying to pull the moment out of last night's chaos. Darkness, flashing red lights, gunfire, and a familiar face blocking her path. An older man, gray hair. She opened her eyes, and he smelled like antiseptic. Dead silence. People in the room exchanged looks, and Cassie saw recognition spread across their faces. Ronan's voice dropped to a whisper, a growl barely held in check. Dr. Webb. Kieran immediately checked his phone, scrolling through reports his team had gathered. A few minutes passed, then he looked up. His face drained pale. We found encrypted messages on Webb's phone, sent to your rival 2 days before the attack, including the mansion layout, the guard schedule, and... He hesitated. And Finn's medical information. Cassie felt nausea rise in her throat. Dr. Harrison Webb, the man who had cared for the Hale family for 10 years, had sold them out, had sold out Finn. Ronan stood perfectly still, but his body trembled with rage. When he finally spoke, his voice was so cold Cassie felt it in her bones. Bring him here. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Kieran nodded and left. Cassie looked at Ronan and saw the fury boiling beneath his calm exterior. She knew what was about to happen, and she wasn't sure she wanted to witness it. Beneath the Hale estate, there was another basement, not the safe room with bright lights and stored food. This was the basement no one wanted to step into. Gray concrete walls, a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, and the stench of dampness tangled with the smell of fear. Dr. Harrison Webb sat on a wooden chair in the middle of the room, his hands and feet bound tight. His face was the color of death, sweat running down his forehead and soaking into his collar. His eyes jerked around the room like a trapped animal searching for a way out. Ronan stood in front of Webb, a knife in his hand, not a kitchen knife. This was a combat knife, its blade bright under the weak yellow light. His face was ice, empty of emotion. This was the Chicago devil the whole city feared. Cassie stood at the doorway, her heart hammering inside her chest. She didn't know why Ronan had allowed her to be here, or maybe he had told her to come, but she couldn't leave. She needed to see. She needed to know who Ronan Hale truly was. Ronan moved toward Webb, the knife glittering in his hand. His voice stayed low and even, more frightening than any shouting. Why, Harrison, after everything. Webb trembled, tears spilling down his cheeks. She's just a nurse. I've been your doctor for 10 years. But you look at her like... Ronan tilted his head, eyes flat and cold. Like what? Webb swallowed, his voice cracking. The way you looked at Lydia... Dead silence. Ronan went still. Cassie went still. The whole basement felt like it stopped breathing. Lydia, Ronan's late wife. The woman in the photograph on the shelf. The woman Finn could not remember but pretended to remember so his father would not be sad. Webb had just said Ronan looked at her the way he looked at Lydia. Cassie didn't know how to react. She looked at Ronan and saw his shoulders tighten, his jaw clamp hard. Then he stepped closer to Webb and lifted the knife. Webb sobbed, his voice turning shrill. Please, please spare me. I'll do anything. Please. Cassie held her breath. She thought Ronan would stab. She thought she was about to witness a murder. But Ronan stopped, the blade only a few centimeters from Webb's throat. Then he lowered his hand. Death is too easy for you. Ronan's voice was ice. He turned to Kieran, who stood in the corner. Hand him over to the police, with evidence of violating medical confidentiality rules and conspiracy to commit murder. Let him rot in prison. Kieran nodded. Cassie understood immediately. Webb would go to prison, and in prison, word would spread that he had betrayed the Hale Empire. Men who wanted to earn Ronan's favor would come looking for Webb. He would never have a peaceful day again. Death would have been kinder. Ronan turned to Cassie and walked toward her. His gray eyes held hers, searching for something. Are you afraid of me now? Cassie looked at him. She saw both the monster and the man in those eyes. He could have killed Webb. He had the power to do it, and no one would have dared to speak. But he had chosen not to kill. I'm afraid, she admitted, her voice small but steady. But I understand, too. Ronan raised an eyebrow. You understand? Cassie drew a slow, deep breath. You're a monster to your enemies, but not to your son, and not to me. Ronan watched her for a long time, as if weighing every word she had just spoken. Then he stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body. "You saw the worst of me tonight." Cassie didn't step back. "I've seen worse. At least you have a reason for what you do." Ronan looked at her, and for the first time, something in those gray eyes wasn't cold anymore. A flicker, a trace of warmth, something Cassie didn't dare to name. 1 week after what happened in the basement, life at the Hale estate slowly returned to something that resembled normal. Dr. Webb had been handed over to the police with a full package of evidence, and news of the arrest appeared in the local press. Finn came home safely, and Cassie went back to caring for him the way she always had. But she knew Ronan was planning something. She saw him spending hours in his study, speaking on the phone in a low voice, private and controlled. One afternoon, Ronan called her into the study. When Cassie stepped inside, she saw a thick file on his desk packed with documents and photographs. Ronan sat behind the desk, his expression calm, yet there was something almost satisfied in his eyes. "I looked into Dr. Harrington, the man who fired you." Cassie froze. She hadn't expected Ronan to remember that name, the name she had mentioned only once in the Maybach that day. He slid the file toward her. "You should look through it." Cassie sat down and began turning the pages. What she read made her feel as if the floor had shifted beneath her. Dr. Richard Harrington had a history of insurance fraud stretching across 8 years. He had taken bribes from pharmaceutical companies to prescribe expensive medications patients did not need. And worse, he had covered up at least 3 serious cases of medical malpractice, including a patient who had died. Karen Mitchell, the human resources director, was complicit in burying information and firing employees who dared to speak up. Cassie set the file down, her hands trembling slightly. She had known Harrington was a bad man, but she had not imagined he was that dark. "What do you want me to do with him?" Ronan asked, his voice as casual as if he were commenting on the weather. Cassie looked at him. "What do you mean?" Ronan met her eyes without flinching. "I can make him disappear, or I can make him suffer. It's your choice." Cold ran along Cassie's spine. "Are you asking me to order a man's death?" "I'm asking what you want." Silence settled over the room. Cassie thought of everything Harrington had done to her. The humiliation of being fired, the soaked cardboard box, the bitter rain, the feeling of being worthless. She had every reason to want him dead, but she was not that kind of person. "No," she said, steady and certain. "I don't want anyone to die because of me." Ronan nodded, showing neither disappointment nor surprise. "Then what?" Cassie drew a long breath. "I want him to pay the right way, through the law. I want people to know what he did." Ronan smiled, small but full of meaning. "Justice through the system. I can arrange that." And he did. 2 weeks later, the scandal exploded nationwide. Major outlets ran it under headlines like, "Corruption Exposed at a Chicago Hospital." Harrington's file was mysteriously leaked, and the FBI immediately launched an investigation into St. Michael's Hospital. Cassie watched the news as police arrived at the hospital to arrest Harrington. He was standing in the hallway, still wearing his white coat, when 2 FBI agents stepped forward and snapped handcuffs around his wrists. His face went pale, his eyes frantic as they darted around, searching for help, but none came. Doctors and nurses stood watching, and Cassie recognized many familiar faces, the ones Harrington had bullied, fired, or threatened. They stood there without pity, without a single voice raised in his defense. And at the corner of the hallway, Mr. Wallace, the elderly security guard who had seen her out the door that day, stood watching with a satisfied smile on his lips. The trial moved quickly. The evidence was too clear, too overwhelming. Harrington was sentenced to 7 years in prison for insurance fraud and serious medical malpractice. Karen Mitchell was fired, stripped of her professional license, and was now working as a manager at a fast food store in the suburbs. St. Michael's was hit with heavy penalties and forced to overhaul its entire management system. Cassie sat in the mansion's living room, watching the broadcast of Harrington's sentencing on television. Finn sat beside her with a bag of snacks in his hands, eyes curious as he stared at the screen. "Cassie, is that the bad man who fired you?" he asked. Cassie nodded. "Yes, sweetheart." Finn watched Harrington's pale face on the screen as he was led out of the courthouse, then looked back at Cassie. Good. He looks so sad. He deserves to be sad. Cassie smiled and smoothed the boy's hair. Justice might arrive late, but it still arrives. And sometimes it arrives in the shape of a mafia boss who has decided to repay a debt in his own way. 2 weeks after Harrington's scandal exploded, Cassie's phone rang while she was sitting in the living room. She glanced at the screen and startled when she saw St. Michael's Hospital on the caller ID. She hesitated for a second, then answered. "Hello, this is Cassandra Reed." The voice on the other end was polite and professional. "Miss Reed, my name is Dr. Sarah Chen, the new Chief Medical Officer of St. Michael's. I'm calling on behalf of the new board to apologize for what happened to you. Your termination was completely wrongful, and we want to make it right." Cassie went quiet, not sure what to say. "We want to invite you back to St. Michael's," Dr. Chen continued, "not in your old role. We want to offer you the position of head nurse of the emergency department. The salary will be double what you made before. You'll have full authority over staffing and procedures in the department. You'll have a real voice." Cassie felt her heart start to race. Head nurse of the emergency department. It was the position she had dreamed about back when she was a nursing student, full of ideals and fire. "Miss Reed, you'd be perfect for it," Dr. Chen said, her tone sincere. "You can make sure what happened to you never happens to another nurse again. You can change the system from the inside." Cassie didn't answer right away. She stood, the phone still pressed to her ear, and looked around the living room of the Hale estate. Finn was on the rug playing with Max, the golden retriever. The boy's laughter rang out as Max licked his face, tail whipping back and forth. Ronan sat on the sofa with a newspaper in his hand, but his eyes kept drifting toward his son with that tenderness Cassie had learned only she was allowed to see. Afternoon sunlight spilled through the windows, laying a warm golden veil over the room. She remembered the days right after graduation, brimming with energy and ideals. She had wanted to change the world. She had wanted to become someone with a voice in medicine, and now that chance was right in front of her. But she also remembered the last 3 months, the way Finn called her an angel, the night Ronan cried beside his son's bed, the way he held her hand when she spoke about her past, the way he looked at her on Finn's birthday, the way he held her in the safe room after the attack. She had found something here, something she had lost a long time ago, something she never thought she would have again. "Thank you for the offer," Cassie said into the phone, her voice gentle but firm. "I truly appreciate it, but I found where I belong. I'm sorry. My answer is no." She ended the call before Dr. Chen could say anything else. "You just turned down a head nurse job." Ronan's voice came from behind her. She turned and saw he had lowered the newspaper, watching her with an unreadable expression. Cassie smiled. "I turned down a job, not a family." Ronan stood and walked toward her. "A family?" Cassie looked at him, then at Finn on the rug with Max, then back at Ronan. "This is my family now, you and Finn, if you'll have me." Ronan stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see every line of his face, the faint scar through his eyebrow, and the strange light in his gray eyes. "I've wanted to say this for weeks." His voice dropped. "I love you, Cassandra Reed." Cassie felt tears spill over, but they were happy tears. "I love you too, Ronan Hale." Ronan lifted his hand, tipped her chin up, and kissed her. Soft, gentle, as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "Finally you kissed." Finn's shout burst from behind them. They pulled apart and looked back to see him sitting on the rug, arms around Max, his face glowing. "I've been waiting forever." Cassie laughed, and Ronan laughed too, a real laugh that came from deep inside him. It was the first time she had ever heard him laugh like that. 1 year later, on a bright spring day, the back garden of the Hale estate was dressed in pure white flowers. Not lavish, not showy, just simple and elegant, exactly the way Cassie wanted. White chairs were lined up in neat rows on the fresh green lawn, and a narrow aisle covered in white fabric led to a flower arch where Ronan stood waiting. About 30 guests were there, all of them the closest people in their lives. No press, no strangers, only family in the truest sense, the way Ronan and Cassie defined it. Finn, now 10 years old, stood beside his father in a small navy suit. He was so much healthier now, able to run and play like other children, even though he still needed regular checkups. In his hands, he held a small velvet pillow with 2 wedding rings shining on top. Max, the golden retriever, sat beside Finn with a wide white bow at his neck, tail swishing gently as if he understood this was a special day. When the music began, everyone rose and turned toward the end of the aisle. Cassie appeared, and Ronan felt his heart miss a beat. She wore a simple white dress, no glittering stones, no complicated lace, only soft fabric that fell in clean lines over her body. Her hair was pinned up, a few loose strands brushing her cheeks, and she wore no jewelry except a pair of small pearl earrings. She didn't need to be dazzling, she only needed to be herself. And for Ronan, that was everything. Ronan waited in a black suit, a white flower pinned to his pocket. As Cassie drew closer, she saw his eyes were wet. The Chicago devil, the Mafia boss who had made the whole city fear him, was crying on his wedding day. And when she stood before him, he couldn't hide his smile, the smile she had loved from the first time she ever saw it. The officiant began the ceremony, and when it was time for vows, Ronan took Cassie's hand and looked straight into her eyes. "A year ago, I thought I didn't have a heart. Then my son almost died, and a nurse walking through the rain appeared. You taught me that strength isn't power. Strength is knowing how to save someone. I want to spend the rest of my life learning from you." Cassie squeezed his hand, her voice trembling with emotion. "A year ago, I thought I didn't deserve to be loved. I had lost everything. My parents, the child I never got to meet, my career. But you and Finn showed me that family isn't what we're born into. Family is what we choose. And I choose you. I choose your son. I choose this house. I choose this life." The officiant had just opened his mouth to continue when Finn shouted, bursting with excitement, "Dad, just kiss Mom already!" Everyone laughed. Ronan laughed. Cassie laughed. And even Kieran, standing in the front row, let a rare smile slip. Ronan didn't wait for the officiant to announce it. He pulled Cassie into his arms and kissed her, a kiss full of love and promise. In the crowd, Mr. Wallace, the elderly security guard from St. Michael's Hospital, dabbed at his eyes with a handkerchief. Cassie had personally invited him, and when he saw the young woman he had once walked to the door, holding a cardboard box, now glowing with happiness on her wedding day, he couldn't hold back his emotion. Dr. Harrington wasn't there. Karen Mitchell wasn't there either. They were exactly where they belonged, paying for what they had done. Ronan had kept his promise to Cassie. He had begun moving his empire into legitimate businesses. Little by little, no more mysterious late-night trips, no more wounds without explanation. For her, for Finn, for the family they were building. And Finn, the boy she had saved as an 8-year-old on a rainy night long ago, now called her Mom. Cassie had said it wasn't necessary, but the boy wanted it. "Cassie has been my mom for a long time," he said. "I'm just calling it the right thing now." The Hale estate wasn't cold the way it had been when she first arrived. Laughter filled the halls. Max's paws thudded across the wooden floors, and Finn's voice calling Mom rang out every day. This was no longer a Mafia boss's palace. This was home. After the ceremony, when most of the guests had left, Cassie stood alone on the balcony, watching cars pull away in the sunset glow. She was still in her wedding dress, still feeling as if she were dreaming. Familiar arms wrapped around her from behind, and Ronan's warmth spread along her back. "Any regrets, Mrs. Hale?" he whispered against her ear. Cassie smiled and leaned her head back against her husband's chest. "No, not even one." That night, after the wedding ended, Cassie stood alone on the balcony, looking out at the city of Chicago stretched beneath the dark sky. Rain was falling. A soft, drifting rain, just like that day, the day she was fired, the day she walked home with a soaked cardboard box in her hands. 1 year ago, she had walked through this same rain, clutching that box, thinking her life was over. She was wrong. She had once believed losing a job meant losing her worth. She had once believed being fired meant she was useless. But sometimes when every door closes, it isn't the end. It's the universe clearing the path for something better, for a convoy of Maybachs, for a desperate father, for a boy who needed her, for a family she never thought she would find. Arms wrapped around her from behind, and Ronan's chin rested gently on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" Cassie smiled, her eyes still on the rain. "I'm thinking I'm grateful Dr. Harrington fired me." Ronan let out a low laugh, his warm breath brushing her neck. "Me too. He's the best matchmaker I've ever met." Small feet pattered onto the balcony, and Finn's voice rang out bright with excitement. "Mom, Dad, it's raining. Let's go dance in the rain." Ronan looked at Cassie, lifting his eyebrows as if asking her. Cassie laughed. "Why not?" The three of them stepped out into the garden under the rain. Finn ran across the grass, laughter echoing, Max racing after him, barking. Ronan took Cassie's hand and spun her once, like a dance meant only for the two of them, and she laughed, a real laugh rising from the deepest part of her, the kind of laughter she thought she had forgotten after so many years of pain. The rain kept falling, but this time it didn't feel like a funeral. It felt like a baptism for a new life, a new family, a new beginning. And Nurse Cassandra Reed, no, Cassandra Hale, had finally come home. This story teaches us that sometimes the worst things that happen are the doors that lead to the most wonderful things. Never measure your worth by what others say about you. And remember that family is not what we are born into, but what we choose and build with love. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to share this video so more people can hear meaningful stories like this one. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever lived through moments that seemed like the end but turned out to be a new beginning? Share with us in the comments below. We would love to hear what's deep in your heart. Thank you for watching all the way to the end of the video. We wish all of you good health, a joyful life, and peace every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.